A great thing to think about when you're texturing is form. In other words, if you look at the main shapes, like let's say this eye socket right here, are the black and white values, are the dark and bright areas trying to emphasize the main flow, the main directions, the main forms that exist on this object? And if they're not, then it's a good idea to try to emphasize the main shapes. It just makes it easier for your eye to understand what the object is and how this works in three-dimensional space. That's exactly why we created the ambient occlusion layer earlier. So if we go down here to, let's say, I think it's this guy, we should rename that. So let's take this fill to the very top. There we go. Okay, so that's our edges. We'll name that edges. And this guy is the occlusion. And right away, you could see what that just did. So I've already set this up. Base color, multiply. And look at that. Look at the difference. Before, after. It just looks so much more appealing. Now, it's not realistic. If your goal is absolute realism, this is not the way to do it, because in reality, oftentimes when you look at these reference images, the reason why, let's say, the inside of the skull is dark is not because the skull itself is dark, it's just because of the lighting, right? And we're looking at a real-time preview, so the lighting is not the greatest. But even with that in mind, it usually looks just a little bit better, a little bit more appealing when you have some of these forms being emphasized. Look at right here. Look at this dark area around the tooth. Notice how it just takes that form and it brings it all the way to the top. That line isn't being caused by the occlusion, but the reason why you're able to pick up on that direction, that flow, is because of the value differences right here. So another exercise on top of occlusion is this. Let's create a new paintable layer. So not a fill layer, but a paintable layer, which is right here. And let's call this our shaping dark. And let's go to a very subtle brush. So we'll go here and let's go for maybe this artistic soft, or maybe something a bit more for right now. This, let's say this cement 2, okay? If we go to the right-hand side right here, we can select the color and what we're trying to do. We only want to affect color, so turn everything else off for right now, and I'll set that to black. Okay, so let's say that, again, we have this line, we can tell what's going on. If I wanted to emphasize that line, what I can do is I can start creating these supporting shapes. So I could start doing stuff like this. And, you know, maybe that's a little bit too much. We kind of blend that out a little bit like that. But if we end up doing something like that, set this to multiply and then bring it all the way down to 0 and just barely do any of that. Just like right there. Watch this. Before, after. Look at how much stronger that line is. And so this is really important because if you want to have an object that looks very readable, like you see it, you know what the forms are, it feels three-dimensional, being able to emphasize some of these things is a great technique for showing off the model as well as bringing out certain characteristics of the object. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with some of these teeth. Let's say I want to take these teeth and I want to bring them into the skull a bit. I can use shaping to do exactly that. So let's bring this all the way up to 100. We'll go too far with it. And let's go ahead and let's say go dark in the areas that are not, so there we go, like that are not in a direct line with a tooth. So let's try something like that. And this is where you can kind of start blending it in. With your paint strokes, go in the direction that you're trying to emphasize. So, you know, we can kind of blend it maybe a little bit just with a light touch. Maybe we can go towards this cheekbone and then emphasize this cheekbone and let the forms flow into here a bit. And so we can end up doing something like that, okay? And now again, we've gone too far with this, but watch what happens when I go to 0, it's not there anymore, and I just bring it up right maybe around there. Before, after. And then we can go to our eraser and we can erase some of the areas that we went too far on. And so if you go back and forth between occlusion and just general painting when it comes to the form, it's going to really help your models look great. And this is a trick that most people never think about. Now, this is also not something that's limited to darkening certain areas. You can also brighten. And that's kind of what we're doing with these edges. If we go to the edges and we say, as an example, add, or we say screen right there. Notice how as we go back, we can really tell, look at that eye socket. You can tell all the way from back here what that shape is. And that's because we brightened it around the rim right here. And so if we go before and after, you can see, generally speaking, what that does. Now, this is too far. We don't want that happening quite as intensely. So what we could do is just pick some areas that we like. Let's say maybe an overall effect of 72, do a black mask, and then let's say we want to emphasize the nose as an example. We can go here, and let me make sure I'm on the brush here. Yeah, on the brush, edges, a value of 1, we could start bringing that back. And then let's also turn this up to 100 just so we can see what's going on. So there you have it. This is all very subtle stuff. The key is to be subtle. Make moves that are not obvious. But once you turn it off and on, you can see what things gradually do over time. And really at this point, it's just a matter of looking at the reference, looking at the images that you've gathered ahead of time, and then adding things layer by layer. So let's go through everything that I have here. We start off with the base. That's what you saw before. I added a little bit more complexity with this base bone too. And if we zoom in here, you can kind of see that. So I'll turn it off and then on. You can see that it's just breaking up that base layer a little bit more. And I liked how that looked. Then I added these pop marks, which really added a lot to the base bone. And then after that, we have the darker coloration. This added a bit of saturation and started pushing some of that form. We then have this extra grimy layer, and this is just a heavy version of dirt. And I think it's nice, especially here towards the middle of the nose, because it breaks up the shape. It adds something that's a bit unique to certain areas of the skull, and it makes it feel like it's not just this repeating pattern. After that, I applied the occlusion, so there's that, and then a bit of shaping. So there's the shaping dark, shaping light, we brightened the teeth, highlighted the eyes. We now have the edges right there. I added this little side skull crack. You don't want to get too close to this because it breaks down really quickly. As soon as I do that, you can really tell that it's looking, unrealistic at that point. But from back here, perfectly fine. We have this extra grimy, so a bit more shaping. I wanted to bring in another texture and shape with that texture in mind. So we have that. I added some large holes right there. I then smoothed certain areas out. I was finding that the bone was just getting too bumpy in general. And so for this layer right here, I basically just smoothed out the height field. And you can kind of see that if we go to the highlights, look towards the top of the head right there. So before, after. You can see what that did right there. And then lastly, I wanted to brighten the teeth a little bit. So I brightened that teeth. That separated the teeth out from the rest of the skull in a visual sense. So the different colors of the teeth made it feel like its own section when looking at the whole skull. So anyway, that is a breakdown of the layers that I did for this. There's really no right or wrong answer, and honestly, with the white teeth, that's not something I saw in the reference, but it's just something that I thought would look good. So really, it's all about making decisions that you think will look great. The reference is your guide. It's where you go if you don't know what to do. And from there, you can just experiment and try things. Some things will work, some things won't work. Keep the things that do, and you'll eventually end up with something that you might be happy with. Now for the skull, we could take this further. We could add some more things to it. But I think at this point, given how far away the camera is, this is enough detail for the time being. So let's export these maps. I'll talk about a great way of importing texture maps with Houdini, and we'll go from there.